This is a comprehensive guide for every type of save that you can do in Football Manager to get you started on your FM26 journey. In addition to going through each type of save, I'm also going to show you guys how to load the database, or at least give recommendations on how to load the database. So that way, once you get started on the game, you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. You can just jump right into things. And for each save, we're going to start with the more popular types of Football Manager saves and stuff that people are most likely to want to do. Then move into things that might be a little bit more difficult and stuff that you might do if you're more seasoned at Football Manager. And then finally, we're going to end with some just absolutely insane saves if you're just a crazy Football Manager player. All right, so let's start a new career, move into the advanced career setup. And for our first save, arguably the most popular save, certainly on YouTube, is the regular rebuild save. For the rebuild save, this is probably the most popular in Football Manager. For the most part with this kind of save, you're just taking a team and trying to make them as good as you can make them. This is how I played Football Manager for most of the time that I've been playing Football Manager. I just took my favorite team, tried to rebuild them to former glories. But there are also many versions of the rebuild save that you can do to spice it up a little bit. You can take a fallen giant and try to rebuild them to former glories. Especially with a club like Bordeaux, that might be one of the most interesting ones in FM26. Another option is to simulate 20 years into the future when a lot of clubs and a lot of players will have completely changed by then. And you can take a club that is currently good and see what clubs might have fallen 20 years in the future and do a fallen giant type save, but in a Football Manager world. Like I've done before, you can also just take over your favorite team and try to build them up as best as you can. There's tons of fun examples of that type of save all over YouTube. I think a really fun one is Tom FM did this with Lincoln City. Definitely check that out if you want to see what that kind of save might look like. And finally, potentially one of the most popular types of rebuild saves is taking a club in the lower divisions of a country and trying to build them up to win the Champions League or at least make it in the top division. There are plenty of really famous examples of this all across YouTube. Most recently, Zealand did this with Taunton Town. Work the Space does this every year with his Parc de Prem saves, and I think Lelujo does this with non-league to Prem. And as far as creating a database for a rebuild save is concerned, the most important thing you're going to want to do is just make sure that you load the country of the team you're rebuilding in. For example, if you were doing this in Europe, I think England is the most popular place in Football Manager to do a rebuild save. So you could just click on England, and if you were doing a lower league type save, just make sure you load up the lower leagues. Just make sure you have the leagues available for the team that you want to play with, and you're pretty much all set. In addition to that, though, and if you're thinking about long-term success in a type of rebuild save, you want to make sure, too, you're also loading nations, if your computer can handle this, from areas that you're going to want to sign. So, for example, maybe you're doing a rebuild save in England. You might want to get the France, the Germany, the Spain, and the Italy, since those are kind of the top 5 leagues in Europe. But in addition to those leagues, you might want to load up a Brazil, Argentina, or Colombia, because those are areas you might want to sign wonder kids from. And then you might even want to go a little bit around Europe. Certainly, given the foreign player rules, you might want to get some of the UK countries, such as maybe Northern Ireland. You can bring up Scotland, you can bring up Wales, you can bring up Ireland. All of these countries that are going to help you to be successful in your save. And then you might end up with a very large database like this. And the nice thing that you can do for some of these databases is instead of making them playable, if you know you're only going to stay with one club, you can make them view only or view only below a certain level. That way you still have a lot of these players and countries loaded into the game, so you have a lot of places to sign from, but it's not going to slow your game down as much, and you can get that estimated game speed back up a little bit higher. And for example here, even with including all of these countries, and I do not have the best computer by any means, even with having all of the leagues in England being playable and switching between some view-only and playable leagues around Europe and South America. Even with all these leagues, we can get a pretty large total player count here with a quick estimated game speed. So this is absolutely possible if you're doing a rebuild save. But anyways, those are rebuild saves. Moving into our next type of Football Manager save, it is going to be the Glory Hunter Challenge. And the goal for the Glory Hunter Challenge is you have 20 seasons to win all of the domestic titles and major cup competitions in Europe's top 5 leagues, as well as the Champions League and the Europa League. The setup for this type of save is pretty simple. You're pretty much just going to need Europe's top 5 leagues, as those are the countries you're going to need to win in. You can load up some other leagues as well. You might want to do a Netherlands or a Portugal, or again, load up some South American leagues so that you can bring in some of those wonder kids. But a bare minimum, you're going to want the top 5 leagues in Europe. And if you just have the top 5 leagues in Europe, this is generally going to be a pretty quick playable database, so you can have a lot of detail here. And then for starting the save, you can choose any team from the top 5 leagues. I would recommend, though, just for the extra challenge, don't choose a Man City or a Bayern Munich or PSG. Maybe choose someone like a Dortmund, someone that's close to the top, but maybe not quite there yet. That way you have a little bit of work to do in your 20 seasons. But the Glory Hunter Challenge has been super popular for many years in Football Manager. Dr. Benji did this for years. Omega Luke has been doing it to great effect recently. So if you want to see what those kinds of saves look like, you can check out those channels. All right, moving into our third type of Football Manager save, it is going to be the Pentagon Challenge. And the goal of the Pentagon Challenge is to win the continental competition in 5 different continents. So that's going to mean winning the top continental club competition in Europe, South America, North America, Africa, and Asia. And this is a pretty interesting one because you can set up the database in a number of different ways. One thing about Football Manager databases is you can change them while you're in the game. So you can add and remove leagues while you're in the game, but it does take effect 1 year later from your game start date. So you just need to keep that in mind. At a bare minimum, you're going to want to load up the leagues from where you're starting, the continent that you're starting. So if you're starting in Africa, certainly you're going to want Egypt and South Africa. If you're starting in Asia, you're going to want some of those major Asian leagues, probably in Australia, maybe a UAE, certainly China, Japan, and South Korea are going to be really good places to start in Asia. In Europe, to win the Champions League, it'll probably be very similar to Glory Hunter, where you're picking up at the very least the top 5 leagues in Europe. But you could also add some other leagues where you might have a good chance of winning, such as maybe Portugal or Netherlands. In North America, your best bet is going to be loading up the US and Mexico. And then moving into South America, you're probably going to want at least Brazil and Argentina, but certainly throwing in a Colombia might not be too bad either. And again, you could certainly load up all of those leagues. You'd have a huge player count though, and the estimated game speed might be a little bit slow. So if you have a little bit of a slower computer like I do, one thing you can do is, again, just go by continent. So rather than loading up all those leagues, you can start off in Africa, just do Egypt and South Africa, and then continue to add countries as you go along in the game. That is an option for you. And again, the Pentagon Challenge is a super popular challenge on Football Manager. Tom FM has done that a lot. So if you want to see what that type of challenge looks like, you can go check that. And the last thing I'd say about the Pentagon Challenge, start with no coaching badges and unemployed and just see where you get a job first. That can dictate where you begin the game. That'll make it a lot of fun. And that takes us into our next Football Manager save, which is the journeyman. Most recently, Zealand has done the journeyman save and FM Llama has done this with the quest. But for the journeyman save, it's really fun because you can kind of start this and end this however you want. It's your own career trajectory. It's very much like a manager in real life. You can start this kind of save at anywhere you want as far as your coach is concerned. A lot of people do this unemployed and with no coaching badges, but you can pretty much have free will to start this wherever you'd like. I think it's interesting to start this unemployed and with no coaching badges, and then just load up some leagues that you might find interesting. I've never coached in Egypt before, so I might do that in Africa. I might load up Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, a few countries around Europe, maybe even Canada and North America. But this is fun because you can start off in some really interesting places. And just as we talked about with the Pentagon challenge, you can load leagues as you think you become good enough for those potential job openings and leagues as you progress on in the save. So the journeyman save is really fun because you can just start off in random, interesting areas and just work your way up as you accrue coaching badges and more experience to the upper echelons of the game. And who knows, maybe winning the Champions League with Tottenham Hotspur. Next up, we have the transfer restriction save, and there's a few different types of transfer restriction saves. One type of transfer restriction save is where you only sign players for one specific country or continent. Clates has done this most recently with his Malia save, as well as the save where he was only signing Asian players and trying to win the Champions League. And this type of saves, you're going to want to choose your end goal first. So for example, if you wanted to win the Champions League, in this case, you'd be loading up leagues from Europe for teams that you want to manage. Maybe you want to win the Premier League as well as the Asian Champions League. So then you might click England, for example. But then you're also going to want to decide where you want to sign players from. So if you were doing England and you only wanted to do it with English players, you have everything you need right there. But if you wanted to win the Premier League and the Champions League with, say, only players from Asia, then you need to be a little bit more intentional with your database. Because then you're also going to want to include a lot of Asian countries then. Maybe you want China, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, for example. But then also because you're in Europe, you're going to want to pick teams and countries where you see a lot of Asian players coming through. And for example, you see a lot of maybe Filipinos coming through Spain, a lot of Asian players come through Germany. So those are going to be countries that you're going to want to bring in as well for this type of save. So when you're choosing a transfer restriction database based on a transfer restriction for an area, just make sure you're choosing countries in your database where you're going to see those players come through. That way you have the best possible chance for being successful. There are other types of transfer restriction saves as well. In addition to country, the other option that's usually done is with age. For example, you can only sign players who are under the age of 21 or 18. Maybe you even have to sell players once they reach the age of 28 or 29. That way you can make your save a little bit more interesting, keep it youth focused. And the most difficult example of kind of a transfer restriction save would be a youth intake only save. So this is, you're not allowed to make any transfers and you can only bring in players through your youth intake. I believe Clates did this recently with a club in Italy. Omega Luke has done the youth to gold as a very popular football manager type save. And if you're going to do that type of save, then you're usually going to want to pick a club with a relatively good academy. You can take a Barcelona or a Manchester United and do a youth intake only club with clubs that already have a set youth intake available to you. And if you really want to go crazy with a youth intake only save, click on Spain and do an Athletic Bilbao save where you can only sign players from the Basque region of Spain. You're really going to be relying on your youth intake. It's going to be a crazy transfer restriction. That might be one of the most fun ways to do this kind of save. All right, we are running down through our most popular saves here. 2 popular ones left before we move into the difficult and then the absolutely insane saves. But one of the most popular ones, certainly on YouTube, is going to be the Build a Nation save. And in a Build a Nation save, you are taking a country with a relatively low rating and you're trying to make them one of the best countries in the world. I think probably the most fun example of this is probably going to be something like a Gibraltar or a San Marino. So you're definitely going to want to load that country. And then as well, if you're doing this in Europe, you could also do this in Asia or Africa, South America, North America, try to get Canada up to the same level as Mexico and the US. But if you're doing this in Europe, for example, you're going to want to click on your country, make sure you're loading your leagues, then bring in some of the other big leagues and maybe some areas that you're going to want to sign them from. But I'd at the very least include the top 5 leagues in Europe if you were doing this in Europe. And in the Build a Nation save, you would be trying to, for example, get the Gibraltar Football League to be the #1 league in Europe. So in this case, not only are you building up your team, but you're building up the teams around you and the entire league as a whole, making sure they do well in continental competition so that the reputation of Gibraltar becomes the number one league in the world. And if you wanted to add a little side quest to this to make it a little bit harder, you could even try to build up the national team as well. If you want to see a Build a Nation save in action, I think Second Yellow Card did this with Malta. It's a really fun example of what a Build a Nation save looks like. Definitely go check that out. And finally, the last kind of really big popular save I would say is a Moneyball challenge. This is where you're using data. In a sense, this is a rebuild and transfer restriction save built into one. But this is where you're using data in game to inform your transfers, inform your tactics, and inform how you play the game in a true Moneyball fashion. Again, this is kind of like a type of rebuild. Musterman did this to really good effect, and I think Clates has done this as well. Musterman also has a specific Moneyball skin that I would totally recommend adding if you're going to do the save, as it's going to give you a lot of data. But if you're going to do this type of save, you're going to want to choose the team that you want to rebuild with. I think a great example of this would be doing like a Brentford. I think Brentford would be really awesome for a Moneyball save. And again, I would load the country of the team that you're playing in the league with. And then I'd just load up some other interesting leagues that you might think you want to sign players from as well. So again, maybe Wonder Kids from South America. But in this case, since it's Moneyball, maybe you don't want Brazil and Argentina. Maybe you want a Colombia or a Peru or a Chile. I think getting some countries from Eastern Europe makes it really interesting as well, because those players are going to be cheap and high value players generally. So there's a lot of options here if you're going to load up leagues for a Moneyball save. But all right, that takes care of the most popular saves. Now let's get into saves where I would say we're really ramping up the difficulty. And for the first type of really difficult save, there's two versions of this, but I would call this a director of football save. So there are two versions of a director of football save. One is where you delegate all of the transfers, the contracts, and the signing of staff to your director of football, and all you do is control coaching and tactics. In this sense, you're a true football manager, but this ramps up the difficulty to the game tenfold, because most of the time, the director of football isn't very good at signing players, so you're just left with what the AI is giving you. And if you want to do this type of save, you'll choose your team, go into the staff responsibilities, and delegate where appropriate. At least delegate transfers, delegate contracts, and delegate staff. And that will be a very difficult challenge. The other version of this, rather than you delegating everything to the director of football, the other version of this is where you become the director of football. So you control transfers, contracts, and signing of staff, but you leave the coaching and the management to your assistant manager. And in this case, you have the opportunity to hire and fire your assistant manager. You're going to go into responsibilities and dedicate everything in game to the assistant manager. And then the nice thing is, because we have the new instant result tab, you can use the instant result to help you fly through the game. So again, in that version, you're doing the transfers, you're doing the contract negotiations, but you're leaving the tactics and the end game to your assistant manager. The next option to really ramp things up would be to do an attribute-less save or a no attribute save. So in this case, you can develop a special skin. I believe Musterman has a skin for this, where you completely wipe out all the attributes. You're 100% going on star ratings, on scouting reports, and on training reports. And that's just going to take the game to a whole different level, especially when you start getting new gens in where you don't really know them very well, and you're really having to get into the weeds of the game, understanding scouting, understanding training reports, and understanding their form and how they look in the match engine to really see how good the players might be. I'm not a huge fan of the no attribute save. I don't think I would ever do this personally, but a lot of people really love that option. It can take the difficulty of Football Manager to a completely new level. Following on from the no attribute save, you can also do an option to really ramp up the difficulty of Football Manager by creating a save completely built around some crazy tactic, and your goal is, no matter the club, you're trying to make that crazy tactic work. I think this is a really great option with this version of Football Manager since you have the tactic revamp, you have the in possession and out of possession. So you can do some really wild things of trying to build around a tactic in Football Manager. Maybe you want to do something more defensive. Maybe you want to go all out attacking. This is a really fun option. We've done this a few times in Football Manager where we've taken ancient tactics or 150-year-old tactics and tried to make them work. Dr. Benji also did this with Derby County, where he did a strikerless formation and built his save around that strikerless tactic. This is a really fun option if you love a certain type of tactic and want to build your Football Manager save around that. And of a similar note, rather than building around a tactic, you can also build around a specific player. I did this with Anthony in Football Manager 24 with Manchester United. You can also build around a specific position, maybe rather than trying to make one specific player be the star of your team. You could build around a position. Maybe you could build around specifically the wingbacks, or maybe trying to get a goalkeeper to win the Ballon d'Or. There's a lot of options here if you want to focus on one thing to kind of build your save around. And finally, you can choose specific teams where there are specific teams who have crazy challenges in Football Manager that just ramp up the difficulty to a whole new level. We talked a little bit earlier about Athletic Bilbao, where you can only sign players in the Basque region of Spain. But I think arguably the most difficult challenge in Football Manager is the FC Vaduz challenge and trying to win the Champions League with a club in Liechtenstein. So Liechtenstein clubs are really special examples because they're guest clubs in the Swiss leagues. And because they're guest clubs in the Swiss leagues, they actually can't qualify for European competition through the Swiss league. So the only way that clubs from Liechtenstein can qualify for European competitions is by winning the Liechtenstein Cup. And the Liechtenstein Cup gets you entry into the UEFA Conference League. And from there, you would have to win the UEFA Conference League to get into the Europa League. And then you would have to win the Europa League to get into the Champions League. And then you have to win the Champions League. But the thing is, you have to do this in back-to-back-to-back seasons because you could get to the Champions League, get knocked out, and then you have to win the cup and you're back down to the UEFA Conference League. So this is arguably the most difficult challenge in Football Manager. You can do this with Vaduz, which is the best club in Liechtenstein, or if you want to make this challenge really hard, choose a worse Liechtenstein team, take down Vaduz, and then take down Europe. But those are difficult challenges. Now we're ending with the absolutely most insane Football Manager saves. And to start off, we can do a multi-club ownership save. And this kind of save, you can follow the models of Red Bull with Red Bull Leipzig and Salzburg, or you can even follow the Man City ownership model. And in this model, you can have multiple managers at multiple clubs of your choosing. Clates did this with a few different clubs where he made his own energy drink company and built a multi-club ownership model. And in this model, you can move managers and clubs to your ownership teams. You can build a group of clubs to dominate the world. But this is an absolutely insane save because you're not just controlling one club, but in this case, you're controlling multiple clubs with your ownership model. This is a super fun idea. Definitely a long one. Definitely a kind of insane save, but it's a lot of fun. The next insane save is do a rebuild, but do a rebuild of a club that you're not actually managing. This was a really fun save that we did in FM24, where I took over and managed Man City, and I used all of Man City's resources and their vast amounts of money and all of the players that they had. But instead of actually using that to help Man City, I was using all of that money to help Crawley in League Two. And in this kind of save, I was signing Crawley's players to put in a bunch of money for them. I was trying to loan them all the players that I could in order for them to have a squad that could be successful and could get promoted. I will say this is an extremely difficult type of save because they have their own manager and you're trying to loan them players and sign players that fit into their managerial model, and hopefully, they'll be successful, but you never know what the AI is going to do. So this is a really fun type of save. And then you also have to make sure you don't get fired for the team that you're actually managing so that you can keep those resources, because you're going to be doing some really weird things if you're trying to build up a League Two club with 200 million pounds worth of resources. So that is a really fun save. But now for the final save, our absolutely most insane save that you can do in Football Manager. And it is the Destroy a Club Challenge. Take one of the best clubs in the world with massive financial resources. Take your Man Cities, take your Real Madrids. If you're a Scottish person, take over a Celtic. Become the manager of that club and try to destroy the club, destroy their finances, get them relegated. But you have to do all of that by not getting fired. This type of save is the most fun I've ever had playing Football Manager. We did a destroying Man City save in FM24. This will definitely be coming back in FM26, but I highly recommend it because it is an absolutely insane save. And again, the goal of the save is to become the manager of a club, and you have to make bad signings, you have to make bad staff appointments, you're trying to destroy the finances of the club and get the club relegated. But you have to do all of this without getting fired. So can you destroy the club over many, many seasons? Do it in a way where it's very slow, very calculated, so that you can keep playing the game. You don't get fired. Destroy the club from within. But anyways, that wraps up all the different types of Football Manager saves that you can do moving into FM26. You've got your rebuilds, you've got your challenges, you've got your really, really difficult challenges with maybe no attributes or the Vaduz challenge, and then you have your absolutely insane saves, such as a destroying Man City type save. Let me know if you guys are doing any other types of save that I might have missed here, or if you have any other recommendations, leave them in the comments below. But otherwise, I hope you guys are doing well. I hope you guys are taking care of yourselves, and I will see you all next time. Bye!